My husband stood in the middle of a crowded hospital waiting room, looked at my weeping mother, and told me that my dying father was my problem. He proudly declared that his money was his own and my money was mine. I simply nodded and agreed with him. He walked away smirking, completely unaware that his arrogant declaration would soon cost his family everything. Within 2 weeks, I cut off the $3,000 a month I had been secretly using from my own income to fund his parents and his spoiled sister. The panic that followed was an absolute masterpiece. Before I continue the story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a toxic partner a lesson they will never forget. My name is Rebecca, and I'm 34 years old. I work as a data analytics consultant here in Boston, Massachusetts. Until that terrible afternoon, I thought I had a solid modern marriage built on equal partnership and mutual respect. I believed that when the vows said for better or for worse, the person standing next to me actually meant it. I was deeply and foolishly mistaken. The nightmare started on a Tuesday that began like any other. I was at my desk running predictive models for a major retail client when my phone rang. It was my mother, Martha. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. My father, John, had collapsed while mowing the lawn. The paramedics had taken him to the nearest hospital, which happened to be a private, highly specialized facility downtown. I dropped everything, grabbed my purse, and drove like a madwoman through the heavy Boston traffic. The hospital waiting room was a sterile, freezing expanse of pale gray walls and uncomfortable vinyl chairs. The smell of strong antiseptic and stale coffee clung to the air, mixing with the overwhelming scent of fear. I found my mother huddled in a corner chair, clutching her purse to her chest like a life preserver. Her face was pale, and her hands shook violently as I wrapped my arms around her. My father was in the intensive care unit. He had suffered a massive and severe cardiac event. The doctors said he needed an immediate, highly specialized emergency procedure to stabilize his heart. But there was a massive problem. Because the ambulance had rushed him to this specific private hospital to save his life, he was completely out of their insurance network. The billing administrator, a woman with tired eyes and a sympathetic but firm voice, had just pulled my mother aside. She explained that to proceed with the emergency surgery using their top cardiac team, they required an upfront deposit of $15,000. For a retired couple living on a fixed pension, $15,000 might as well have been $1 million. My parents had worked hard their entire lives. My father was a high school history teacher, and my mother managed a small local bookstore. They saved what they could, but recent inflation and medical costs for my mother had drained their modest savings. Seeing my mother weeping in that cold corner, absolutely paralyzed by financial panic, while her husband of 40 years fought for his life, broke my heart into pieces. I held her trembling hands and promised her I would take care of it. I told her not to shed another tear over money. I thought about my father. He was the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who stayed up late helping me with complex math homework, who always told me I could achieve anything I put my mind to. The thought of losing him simply because we were in the wrong hospital network was unbearable. I looked at the crinkled piece of paper in my hand. $15,000. It was a massive sum, but we had well over that amount sitting in our joint emergency account. David and I both earned six-figure salaries. We lived comfortably in a nice suburban house. We took vacations. We drove nice cars. We had the means to fix this instantly. When we got married 4 years ago, David insisted on setting up a joint emergency fund. He was obsessed with the idea of financial responsibility and traditional family roles. He always said that a married couple should combine their safety nets. We poured our savings into a high-yield joint account designed specifically for moments exactly like this one. However, David had insisted on setting up the account with a dual signature requirement for any withdrawal over $10,000. At the time, he claimed it was a security measure to protect our wealth from fraud. I had agreed, trusting him completely. I trusted that the man I married would never hesitate to use our shared resources to save my father. I pulled out my phone and dialed David. My hands were shaking, but my voice remained steady. I explained the situation, told him about the massive heart attack, the out-of-network complication, and the required deposit. I told him I needed him at the hospital right away to sign the authorization so we could release the funds and save my father. David sounded annoyed on the phone. He said he was at a very important client lunch and that I was interrupting a major deal. He worked as a corporate sales director and was always deeply concerned with optics and impressing his peers. I pleaded with him, explaining that this was a matter of life and death. He let out a loud, dramatic sigh that I could hear clearly over the background noise of a busy restaurant. He told me he would be there as soon as he finished his drinks, making it clear that my family tragedy was an inconvenience to his afternoon schedule. The next hour stretched into something endless. I paced between the admissions desk and the intensive care unit doors, checking my phone every few minutes while the rain hammered against the hospital windows. The transfer itself would take less than a minute. I would initiate it. David would approve the security prompt and the $15,000 would be released. I brought my mother a cup of vending machine coffee and wrapped my cardigan around her trembling shoulders. She kept asking whether David was really coming, and each time I told her yes. I still believed my husband would walk through those doors, sign the authorization, and help me save the man who had welcomed him into our family. All I could do was keep my mother calm and wait for him to arrive. The billing coordinator paged me to the desk one more time. Her voice was gentle, but the policy was rigid. The surgical team was ready, but the hospital administrators needed the financial hold cleared. I explained that the funds were in a joint account requiring dual authorization for large transfers, and that my husband was walking into the building at that very moment. I felt a surge of relief when I finally saw David approaching the automatic doors. I stood up and rushed toward him, ready to pull up the banking app on my phone and get this nightmare over with, completely unaware of the devastating cruelty he was about to unleash. He strolled through the sliding glass doors with a slow, deliberate pace that completely ignored the crushing urgency of a hospital intensive care unit. He was wearing his custom-tailored navy suit, the exact one he always reserved for high-stakes client meetings, and his silk tie was slightly loosened at the collar. As I hurried closer to him, the unmistakable scent of top-shelf scotch washed over me, cutting through the sharp, sterile smell of the hospital antiseptic. He had not just finished a quick working lunch. He had been lingering over expensive drinks, laughing with clients while my father was fighting for his very survival. I held out my phone, the screen already glowing brightly, with the pending transfer request from our joint banking application. I just needed him to log into his own app, approve the security notification, and we could get the surgical team moving to save my father. David barely even glanced at me. He checked his heavy silver watch with a dramatic flick of his wrist, letting out a long, annoyed breath. He looked around the crowded waiting area with a look of pure, unadulterated distaste, as if the very presence of sickness, fear, and worry was somehow beneath his social standing. I quickly explained the dire situation again, keeping my voice low but laced with desperate urgency. I told him about the sudden out-of-network complication, the $15,000 immediate deposit required by the billing department, and the specialized surgical team standing by waiting for financial clearance. I pushed the phone slightly closer to his chest, practically begging him with my eyes to just hit the approve button so I could run back to the admissions desk. Instead of pulling out his phone to authorize the life-saving funds, David actually took a step back. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture rigid and defensive, and looked down his nose at me. Then he scoffed. It was not a quiet, private sound of disagreement. It was a loud, sharp, incredibly dismissive scoff that echoed terribly in the quiet, tense waiting area. A passing nurse carrying a stack of charts actually stopped in her tracks and turned to look at us, her brow furrowed in concern. An older couple sitting a few rows away on the uncomfortable vinyl chairs glanced over their expressions, instantly shifting from personal worry to profound pity for me. I felt my face flush with sudden burning humiliation. I pleaded with him again, lowering my voice even further, reminding him that this was my father, the man who had welcomed him into our family with open arms, the man who had paid for a generous portion of our lavish wedding just 4 years ago. I reminded him that the money sitting in that high-yield account was ours, a safety net built from both of our incomes, and that we could easily replace the $15,000 over the next few months without changing our lifestyle in the slightest. David shook his head, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. He raised his voice, making absolutely no effort to keep our deeply personal conversation private. Everyone in the immediate vicinity could hear his every word perfectly. He told me that I was being overly emotional and completely irrational. He said that throwing a massive sum of cash at a hospital without properly reviewing all the billing codes, consulting outside specialists, and exploring insurance loopholes was exactly the kind of poor financial management he absolutely despised. I stared at him, my brain struggling to process what was happening right in front of me. This was not a corporate business negotiation over a quarterly budget. This was a man's life hanging in the balance. My father's life was fading with every passing minute he stood there lecturing me about billing codes. I asked him directly, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes and tracking down my flushed cheeks, if he was really going to let my father die over a temporary hospital deposit. I begged him to just open his app, scan his face, and authorize the wire transfer. I told him I would personally pay back every single cent of his half from my own consulting revenue if that was what it took to make him comfortable. I just needed the funds released immediately so the surgeons could operate. David looked at me, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unyielding selfishness. He did not look over at my weeping mother, who was still huddled in the corner chair praying for a miracle. He did not look toward the intensive care unit doors where the medical staff waited. He looked me straight in the eyes, his jaw set, and delivered a statement that severed the foundation of our marriage in a single devastating instant. "Your parents, your problem, Rebecca. We agreed to be financially responsible. Your money is yours, my money is mine. I am not draining my hard-earned savings to bail out your family's poor planning." His words landed harder than any slap could have. For several seconds, the hospital seemed to disappear around me. The monitors, the nurses, the pounding rain, and my mother's quiet prayers dissolved into a distant hum. Then something inside me became perfectly still. I finally saw David without the illusion I had built around him. He was not protecting our future or setting a responsible boundary. He was willing to let my father die rather than release money that belonged to both of us. Worse, he was willing to humiliate me in front of strangers while pretending his cruelty was financial discipline. My tears stopped. I lowered the phone and looked at the man I had married. He expected another argument, more pleading, perhaps even a public breakdown. Instead, he had given me something far more dangerous: absolute clarity. I nodded smoothly, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my chin held high. I looked him dead in the eye and kept my voice remarkably calm, devoid of any warmth or affection. "You are absolutely right, David. Strict financial separation from this second forward." David smirked, a look of ultimate triumph settling over his handsome features. He puffed out his chest, clearly incredibly proud of himself for setting a firm boundary and putting his emotional, demanding wife in her proper place. He truly thought my calm response was an act of complete submission. He thought I was conceding defeat, accepting his absolute dominance over our shared finances, and agreeing that my father's life was simply not worth his financial inconvenience. He casually adjusted his suit jacket, gave me a patronizing, approving nod, and turned around without another word. I stood there in the harsh fluorescent lighting and watched him walk back through those sliding glass doors, stepping out into the gloomy Boston rain to catch a luxury cab back to his comfortable corner office and his expensive client lunches. He walked away with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he had just won a major defining victory in our marriage. He was completely blissfully unaware that his cruel declaration had just triggered the exact sequence of events that would lead to his absolute catastrophic financial ruin. He had demanded strict financial separation, and I was going to give him exactly what he asked for, down to the very last penny. I turned away from the sliding glass doors and walked straight back to the admissions desk. My steps were no longer heavy with panic. They were measured, deliberate, and fiercely purposeful. The billing administrator looked up, her expression a mix of professional impatience and lingering sympathy. She opened her mouth, likely preparing to tell me that the surgical team could not wait much longer, but I cut her off by sliding a heavy matte black debit card across the polished counter. It was not the blue card connected to the joint emergency fund David and I shared. It was a card linked directly to my private independent business account. David had absolutely no idea this account existed, let alone the massive balance it held. For the entire 4 years we had been married, he treated my career as a data analytics consultant, like a cute freelance hobby. He would pat my shoulder at dinner parties and tell his corporate friends I liked playing with spreadsheets in my home office. He genuinely believed I made just enough money to cover my half of the groceries and gas. Because his fragile ego required him to feel absolutely superior, I never volunteered information about the major corporate contracts I successfully secured or the heavy retainer fees I commanded. I quietly funneled my substantial profits into a high-yield business account, intending to eventually surprise him with an early retirement fund. Now that quiet success was going to save my father. The administrator ran the thick metal card through the terminal. The machine processed for a fraction of a second before printing a remarkably long receipt. Approved. The $15,000 hospital deposit cleared instantly, without requiring a single signature or a moment of hesitation from a man who valued his fragile ego over the survival of my family. I signed the printed receipt, handed it back, and watched carefully as she picked up her desk phone to alert the intensive care unit that the financial hold was officially lifted. A profound, heavy wave of pure relief washed over my chest. My father was going to get the surgery he desperately needed. The immediate terrifying crisis was fully handled, but the dark revelation of my husband's absolute betrayal was only just beginning to unfold. I walked slowly down the long, quiet hospital corridor toward the cafeteria on the ground floor. I desperately needed a moment away from the intensive care unit waiting room, away from my mother's tearful gratitude, and away from the suffocating smell of strong antiseptic. The large cafeteria was mostly empty at this late hour, bathed in harsh, buzzing fluorescent light that made the pale green painted walls look sickly. I bought a large black coffee in a flimsy paper cup and found a secluded table in the far corner. The coffee was incredibly bitter, but the intense heat seeping through the thin paper cup helped to ground my racing thoughts. I sat there in the quiet hum of the room, my mind replaying David's arrogant smirk and his cruel, dismissive words on an endless loop. Your parents, your problem. My money is yours, my money is mine. He had built his entire identity and self-worth around being the traditional, dominant provider. He constantly reminded me, our friends, and anyone who would listen, that his corporate sales director position was the heavy lifting that kept our beautiful household running smoothly. For years, I had blindly accepted that specific narrative. I had trusted his unilateral management of our joint finances because it clearly made him feel important, masculine, and deeply respected. I never once questioned the division of our assets because I genuinely believed we were building a secure life together as equal partners. I pulled my smartphone out of my pocket and set it flat on the speckled laminate table. I opened our joint banking application, resting my thumb on the biometric scanner. The bright screen unlocked, displaying our shared checking and savings balances in bold green text. Usually, I open this particular app only to transfer my agreed share of the household expenses or confirm that a large utility bill had cleared. I had never actually sat down and performed a deep forensic audit of our shared financial life. But my entire professional career was built on carefully analyzing raw data, finding hidden patterns, and exposing the undeniable truth hidden within complex numbers. It was finally time to apply those exact rigorous analytical skills to my own marriage. I navigated straight to the Transaction History tab and set the calendar filter to display the entirety of the last 36 months. I started scrolling slowly, my eyes carefully scanning the long, dense columns of incoming direct deposits and outgoing expenses. The very first thing that struck me was the stark, undeniable reality of our incoming cash flow. I filtered the view to show only the deposits entering the account. Every 2 weeks, David's corporate salary hit the shared ledger. It was a perfectly respectable number, but it was absolutely nowhere near the massive wealth-building fortune he constantly projected to the outside world. Then I changed the filter to isolate my own financial contributions. Every single week, I transferred a set percentage of my consulting revenue directly into the joint account to cover what I believed was my fair equal half of our shared life. The raw objective math did not lie. My regular weekly transfers consistently matched and frequently exceeded David's biweekly corporate salary deposits. I was matching him dollar for dollar month after month. In many months, I was actually the primary breadwinner, depositing the vast majority of the liquid cash into our shared financial pool. The grand illusion he had so carefully crafted over 4 years began to disintegrate right in front of my eyes. He was not the selfless, wealthy provider carrying the heavy financial burden of our household alone. We were funding this comfortable suburban life entirely equally. Yet he dictated every single major financial decision we made. He had stood in the intensive care unit and boldly told me he refused to drain his hard-earned savings, acting as though the money sitting in that joint account belonged solely to him. I took another long, slow sip of the incredibly bitter coffee, my eyes never leaving the illuminated screen. The entire foundation of his financial dominance was a complete fabricated lie, and I was about to dig much deeper into the outgoing transfers to see exactly where my hard-earned money was really going. I cleared the incoming deposit filter on the banking application and switched the view to strictly analyze our outgoing transactions over the past 36 months. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, annoying hum, but my absolute focus remained locked on the glowing screen of my smartphone. I needed to understand the mechanics of the lie I had been living for 4 years. I started by looking at our fixed household expenses. The property taxes, premium homeowners insurance, maintenance costs, and monthly utility bills were all there, paid like clockwork. That part of our financial life aligned perfectly with the 50-50 agreement we had established before we got married. We were sharing the burden of our beautiful suburban house equally. But as I scrolled past the fixed costs and started examining the fluctuating daily expenditures, a vastly different and incredibly disturbing picture began to emerge. The joint account was bleeding cash, and it was not going towards shared groceries or mutual investments for our future. I clicked on a cluster of transactions from the previous week to see the details. There were hundreds of dollars spent at a high-end downtown steakhouse on a Tuesday, a massive bar tab at an exclusive cocktail lounge in the financial district on a Thursday, a heavy charge for premium detailing on his luxury sedan on a Friday. I kept scrolling backward through the months. The pattern repeated with sickening consistency. Designer clothing stores, expensive golf equipment, digital subscriptions, and lavish client gifts that his company allegedly did not reimburse. David was treating our joint operating fund as his own personal limitless piggy bank. He was living the lifestyle of a wealthy corporate executive, but he was funding it directly from the pool of money I was constantly replenishing with my consulting revenue. I sat back against the hard plastic chair and took a deep breath, trying to force the numbers to make logical sense. If David was depositing his biweekly salary into this joint account and spending this heavily on his lifestyle, the overall balance should have reflected a much higher rate of depletion. His salary was substantial, but his spending habits were out of control. Yet the balance always remained relatively stable because I was always pouring money into it. I leaned forward and looked closer at the specific dates surrounding his deposits. I found a large deposit from his employer that hit the account early on a Friday morning. Then I looked at the transactions processed that exact same afternoon. There it was, a massive outgoing transfer. It was not a routine bill payment or a debit card purchase. It was a direct fund transfer to an external routing number. An account completely outside of our shared ecosystem. An account with only one name on it, his. I traced this action backward month by month, year by year. Every time David received his paycheck, he allowed the money to sit in our joint account for a few mere hours to create the illusion of equal contribution. Then, before the day ended, he systematically siphoned out nearly 80% of his earnings, routing them directly into his private account. The sheer audacity of his financial manipulation left me momentarily breathless. He had stood in the hospital waiting room just an hour ago and boldly declared that his money was his and my money was mine. He had acted as though I was the greedy one trying to drain his savings to bail out my family. The reality was the exact opposite. He had actively forced me to deposit my income into the joint account under the guise of marital teamwork and shared responsibility. Then he deliberately used my money to cover the bulk of our shared expenses and fund his own extravagant discretionary spending. All the while, he was quietly hoarding his own wealth. He was a financial parasite feeding off my hard work while building a secret fortress for himself. I felt a cold, sharp anger replacing the initial shock of the brutal betrayal. This was not a simple, innocent misunderstanding about household budgeting. This was a calculated, sustained effort to exploit my trust and my income. I realized that my successful consulting business, the career he always patronized and treated like a cute hobby, was the only thing keeping his illusion afloat. Without my regular deposits, his lavish lifestyle would have drained his salary in a matter of days. He needed me to keep working and depositing all while maintaining the upper hand by making me feel like the lesser earner. I took another sip of my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me as I prepared to dig even deeper into the ledger. If he was funneling his own salary into a hidden account and freely using my money for his daily expenses, I needed to know exactly how deep the exploitation went. I reset the calendar filter on the application this time, deciding to search for large recurring patterns. I wanted to see if there were any other significant leaks in the shared financial pool that I had completely missed over the last 4 years. I adjusted the search parameters to highlight any outgoing transaction over $500. The screen quickly refreshed, populating a long list of high-value charges. I ignored the mortgage and the standard household bills, actively looking for strange anomalies. It did not take long to find them. As I scrolled through the newly filtered list, a very specific, undeniable rhythm jumped out at me from the digital ledger. It was a cluster of transactions that appeared with absolute mechanical precision. I checked the dates corresponding to these specific charges: January 1st, February 1st, March 1st. The pattern stretched back without a single interruption, all the way to the very first month we had opened the joint account together. Every single month, on the very first day of the month, a series of automated wire transfers executed exactly at midnight. They were not categorized under any recognizable vendor loan provider or local utility company. They were carefully routed to 3 distinct external accounts, none of which matched the hidden account David was using to hoard his own salary. The breadcrumbs were laid out perfectly in the digital ledger, glowing brightly against the dark background of my phone screen. Someone else was receiving a massive guaranteed payout for my earnings every 30 days, and the conflict in my marriage was about to deepen in a way I could never have anticipated. I hovered my trembling finger over the first automated wire transfer, completely ready to click the transaction details and expose the final devastating layer of my husband's grand financial deception. I tapped the screen and the transaction details filled my display. The very first automated transfer was for exactly $1,500. I looked at the routing information, my eyes tracing the digital pathway. The recipient line clearly displayed a localized mortgage servicing company. I recognized the name of the lender instantly. It was the exact same regional bank that held the mortgage on the sprawling, manicured property where David's parents, Thomas and Linda, lived. My heart pounded against my ribs as the sickening realization began to take shape. I clicked on the memo line associated with the transfer. There, typed in plain, undeniable text, were the words "Thomas and Linda Primary Residence Payment." I sat completely motionless in the hospital cafeteria. I thought back to every single Sunday dinner we had attended at their immaculate home over the past 4 years. I remembered how Linda would constantly praise David, loudly boasting to extended family members about what an incredibly responsible, successful provider her son had become. She would proudly proclaim that David insisted on taking care of his aging parents, allowing them to live their golden years without financial stress. Thomas would clap David on the back, beaming with paternal pride, while David puffed out his chest and humbly accepted their absolute adoration. And I, the naive, supportive wife, had sat across from them at that massive mahogany dining table, smiling warmly, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the one actually paying for the very roof over their heads. David was not the generous, wealthy son he pretended to be. He was funding his parents' retirement directly from my consulting revenue. My hands were shaking from a burning fury rapidly spreading through my chest. I forced myself to swallow the lump of bile forming in my throat and tapped on the second automated transfer in the monthly cluster. This one was for exactly $1,000. I followed the routing numbers just as I had done before, watching the digital trail lead straight to a luxury automotive financing corporation. The memo line was brief, but devastatingly clear. It read, Brittany Vehicle Lease Payment. Brittany was David's younger sister. At 28 years old, she rarely held down a steady job. She was the quintessential spoiled princess of the family, constantly posting photos of her lavish vacations, designer outfits, and her pristine top-of-the-line luxury SUV on social media. I vividly recalled the day she drove that massive, gleaming vehicle up our driveway. She had bounced out of the driver's seat, bragging about how her wealthy big brother had surprised her with the lease. David had stood right beside her, leaning against the polished hood with a smug, self-satisfied grin, soaking up her endless gratitude. All the while, the $1,000 monthly payment was quietly, automatically draining out of the joint account, fueled entirely by my hard work. I had been subsidizing the glamorous, carefree lifestyle of a 28-year-old woman who routinely mocked my practical wardrobe and called my data analytics career boring. The sheer audacity of his deception made me feel physically ill. I needed to see the absolute bottom of this financial sinkhole. I clicked on the final automated transfer. It was a flat $500. The recipient was an exclusive high society golf and country club located just outside the city limits. This was the same elite club where David spent nearly every weekend schmoozing with his corporate superiors and buying expensive rounds of drinks for potential clients. He always claimed that maintaining his membership there was an absolute professional necessity, a crucial investment in his corporate sales career that eventually paid for itself in lucrative bonuses. Yet, he was not even paying for his own professional networking. He was systematically pulling $500 of my money every single month to fund his elite social status, all while complaining about the cost of my occasional weekend yoga retreats. I set my phone down and calculated the damage. $1,500 a month for his parents' mortgage, $1,000 for Brittany's luxury vehicle, and $500 for his country club membership. $3,000 every month, $36,000 a year. Over 4 years, David had quietly redirected $144,000 from our shared finances to maintain his family's image. The contrast was unforgivable. He had refused $15,000 to help save my father while using nearly 10 times that amount to present himself as a wealthy, generous son and brother. The money was not supporting our marriage or building our future. It was financing a performance in which David received all the praise and I unknowingly paid every bill. The boiling point did not manifest as a dramatic breakdown or a loud, hysterical scene in the hospital cafeteria. It manifested as a profound, terrifying stillness. The woman who had rushed into this hospital an hour ago, terrified and desperately seeking her husband's support, was gone. In her place sat a woman who possessed all the necessary data to orchestrate a catastrophic financial reckoning. I picked up my phone and locked the screen, slipping it safely back into my purse. I finished the last cold, bitter drop of my coffee and stood up from the laminate table. My father was resting peacefully in the intensive care unit, his emergency deposit fully paid, his surgical team actively working to save his life. My mother was sitting safely by his side, blissfully unaware of the dark financial realities I had just uncovered. I had secured my family's survival using my own resources. Now it was time to address the parasites bleeding those resources dry. I walked out of the cafeteria, my heels clicking a steady, relentless rhythm against the polished linoleum floor. I was heading home to prepare for the return of my supposedly wealthy, generous husband. He had demanded strict financial separation, and I was going to ensure he received it with absolute ruthless precision. The drive from the hospital back to our suburban neighborhood felt entirely different than the frantic rush earlier that afternoon. The heavy rain had slowed to a steady drizzle matching the cold, methodical rhythm of my thoughts. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind meticulously organizing the raw data I had just uncovered. I called my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane, who had helped me incorporate my consulting firm years ago. I kept the conversation brief and entirely professional. I needed a standard ironclad post-nuptial agreement drafted immediately, one that mandated absolute unequivocal financial separation. Diane asked no questions, promising to email the expedited document within the hour. By the time I pulled my car into our pristine driveway, the PDF was already waiting in my inbox. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, staring at the warm light spilling from our living room windows. Inside that beautiful house sat a man who believed he held all the power. I printed the document using the wireless printer in my home office, stapled the pages together, and walked downstairs to deliver the illusion of my total surrender. The house smelled faintly of roasted garlic and expensive takeout. David was stretched out comfortably on our large sectional sofa, his expensive suit jacket tossed carelessly over an armchair. He held a bottle of imported craft beer in one hand and the television remote in the other, his eyes glued to a basketball game playing on our massive flat screen. He did not even bother to look up or mute the television when I walked into the room. He simply took a slow sip of his beer and kept his gaze locked on the game. His entire posture projected an air of absolute untouchable comfort. He looked like a man who had successfully disciplined an unruly subordinate and was now peacefully enjoying his well-deserved weekend. I stood behind the sofa watching him for a few seconds. A wave of disgust washed over me, thick and suffocating, but I forced it down, locking it away behind a carefully constructed mask of weary defeat. I needed him to see a woman who had been thoroughly humbled by reality. I walked around the sofa and stood directly between him and the television. David let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh, finally shifting his attention to me. He raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed by the interruption. He asked if my father was still taking up space in the intensive care unit, his tone dripping with profound inconvenience. I kept my expression perfectly smooth, looking down at my hands, before meeting his arrogant gaze. I told him my father was stabilized, but the recovery would be incredibly long and financially draining. I let my shoulders slump, mirroring the heavy burden of a daughter overwhelmed by her family obligations. Then I told him the exact words he desperately wanted to hear. I told him he was absolutely right. I watched his posture shift. The annoyance melted away, replaced instantly by a smug, deeply satisfied smirk. He sat up slightly, placing his beer on the coffee table, suddenly interested in my sudden capitulation. I kept my voice soft and deferential. I told him that his harsh words at the hospital had been a necessary wake-up call. I admitted that my parents had completely failed to plan for their future, and that it was fundamentally unfair to expect him to drain his hard-earned corporate wealth to rescue them. I praised his financial boundaries, telling him I respected how fiercely he protected the lifestyle he had built for us. The more I inflated his ego, the wider his smirk grew. He actually nodded, leaning back against the cushions, with a look of supreme vindication. He told me he was glad I had finally stopped acting so hysterical and started seeing things logically. He reiterated that a man in his position simply could not afford to be dragged down by other people's poor financial choices. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick stack of printed papers. I placed the document gently on the glass coffee table right next to his beer. I told him that I wanted to prove I understood his boundaries completely. I explained that the hospital bills were only going to increase, and my parents would likely need long-term financial assistance that I would have to provide myself. I told him I never wanted him to feel threatened or anxious that my family would come after his corporate savings or his future bonuses. I framed the document as a protective shield custom built entirely for his benefit. I called it a strict financial separation agreement. I told him it guaranteed that from this exact moment forward, my debts were exclusively mine. My family obligations were exclusively mine, and his wealth would remain completely untouchable. David's eyes brightened the moment he saw the agreement. He did not see a warning or a trap. He saw a frightened wife surrendering any future claim to the wealth he believed he possessed. He flipped through the pages without reading more than a few headings. The clauses clearly separated all future income, debts, assets, and family obligations, but his confidence prevented him from examining what those words would mean for him. He did not call an attorney or ask for time to consider the consequences. Protecting himself from my father's medical expenses was all he cared about. David pulled a silver fountain pen from his pocket and signed the final page with a wide, sweeping flourish. "This is the smartest decision you have made since we got married," he said, handing the papers back to me. "Now money will never come between us again." I waited for the ink to dry before closing the folder. "You have no idea how right you are," I replied. Satisfied, he picked up his beer and returned his attention to the basketball game. He believed he had secured his fortune and established complete control. In reality, he had just signed the document that allowed me to stop financing every illusion holding his life together. I woke up the next morning before the sun had even fully crested above the horizon. The house was completely silent, save for the rhythmic, heavy breathing of my husband sleeping soundly beside me. He was sprawled comfortably across the mattress, entirely undisturbed by the financial reckoning he had set into motion. I slipped out of bed with practiced silence, gathering my clothes and dressing in the guest bathroom. I chose a sharp, tailored gray suit, the kind of outfit that commanded absolute professional respect. Today was not a day for casual comfort. Today was a day for executing a flawless business transaction. I grabbed my leather briefcase, ensuring the signed post-nuptial agreement was tucked securely inside a rigid folder. I paused at the kitchen counter to brew a quick cup of dark roast coffee, listening to the soft drip of the machine. The digital clock on the microwave glowed 6:30. The bank branches downtown opened promptly at 8 a.m., and I fully intended to be their very first customer of the day. I left a brief generic note on the counter telling David I had early client meetings and walked out the front door into the crisp, cool morning air. The drive into the city felt remarkably peaceful. The morning traffic had not yet reached its usual chaotic peak, allowing me to drive with a steady, unhurried pace. I turned on a classical music station, letting the precise mathematical rhythm of the strings steady my breathing. I went over my checklist mentally, ensuring I had every account number, every routing code, and every piece of identification I would need. I parked my car in the parking garage adjacent to our primary banking branch just as the heavy glass doors were being unlocked by a security guard. I walked into the grand marble-floored lobby and approached the reception desk with absolute confidence. I asked to speak directly with our assigned relationship manager, a polite, meticulous man named Mr. Harrison. Because of the substantial balance I historically maintained in my private business accounts, I was immediately ushered back into his glass-walled office. He greeted me with a warm, professional smile, asking how my morning was going and inquiring if David would be joining us. I took a seat in the comfortable leather chair opposite his desk and smiled back pleasantly. I told him David was occupied with his corporate duties, but that I had some immediate, highly specific administrative updates to process regarding our joint checking and savings portfolios. I opened my briefcase and retrieved the signed post-nuptial agreement, sliding it smoothly across his polished mahogany desk. I instructed him to read the specific clauses regarding the immediate, total separation of marital finances. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses and spent a few minutes reading over the heavy legal document. I watched his eyebrows raise slightly as he reached the final page and saw David's bold, unmistakable signature affirming the new financial arrangement. He looked up at me, his professional demeanor remaining perfectly intact, though I could sense his underlying curiosity. He asked how I would like to proceed with the current joint holdings. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotional inflection. I told him I needed to immediately sever my primary direct deposits from the shared account and reroute them exclusively to my private business holding account. I also requested that my name and personal liability be legally detached from the joint account, transferring sole ownership and operating authority entirely to David, exactly as outlined in the signed legal directive sitting in front of him. Mr. Harrison reviewed the agreement carefully before turning to his computer. He explained that removing one owner from a joint account would require additional authorization from both account holders. That did not interfere with the part of my plan that mattered. I was free to redirect my own income and move the portion of the available balance that could be traced directly to my contributions. Within minutes, every future payment from my consulting clients had been rerouted to my private business account. The stream of money that had kept David's lifestyle functioning was officially severed. Mr. Harrison then produced a detailed accounting of the current balance. Together, we separated David's deposits from mine and calculated the household expenses that had already been incurred. I transferred my remaining personal funds out of the joint account, leaving David's own money untouched, and enough to cover only the legitimate expenses for which I was currently responsible. Then I asked him to display the scheduled transfers. The 3 recurring payments appeared on the screen: $1,500 to his parents' mortgage company, $1,000 to Brittany's vehicle lender, and $500 to David's country club. I did not cancel them. Those payments had been created by David for the benefit of his family. Under the financial separation, he had demanded they were now entirely his responsibility. I instructed Mr. Harrison to leave the authorizations active and print a complete record showing when they had been created, where they were going, and how much had been withdrawn over the previous 4 years. On the first of the month, the system would attempt to process all 3 payments exactly as David had arranged. But without my consulting income constantly replenishing the account, his salary would have to support them. If he failed to provide enough money, the transactions would be rejected, and the consequences would belong entirely to him. I signed the deposit redirection forms, activated transaction alerts, and placed the printed records inside my briefcase. I had not tampered with his money or interfered with his obligations. I had simply stopped using my income to protect him from the cost of his own decisions. When I walked out of the bank, the morning air felt different. David's financial system was still operating exactly as he had designed it. The only thing missing was me. I walked to my car with a renewed sense of purpose. The immediate threat of the joint account was neutralized, but my defensive strategy was far from complete. I had severed David's access to my daily cash flow, but I still needed to construct an impenetrable fortress around my long-term accumulated wealth. I drove directly from the banking district to a discreet high-end wealth management firm located on the opposite side of the city. I had scheduled an emergency consultation with Benjamin, an elite fiduciary and wealth protection specialist I had researched over the past year but never formally retained. Today, his specific set of skills was absolutely essential. His office was a stark contrast to the busy public lobby of the commercial bank I had just left. It was located on the 40th floor of a sleek glass high-rise, completely insulated from the noise of the Boston traffic below. The reception area was quiet, furnished in dark leather and polished chrome, projecting an atmosphere of absolute discretion and serious financial power. Benjamin was a sharp, meticulous man in his late 50s who understood immediately that my sudden, unannounced arrival meant business. He ushered me into a private conference room overlooking the harbor and offered me a glass of sparkling water. I declined taking a seat at the long mahogany table. I did not waste his time with the emotional details of my failing marriage or my husband's stunning arrogance at the hospital. I spoke strictly in terms of asset protection, liability shielding, and aggressive wealth management. I laid out the full extent of my financial portfolio, including several high-performing technology stocks I had quietly purchased years ago, and the massive projected revenue pipeline for my independent consulting firm. I instructed Benjamin to immediately establish an ironclad, irrevocable trust. I needed a financial vehicle that would completely insulate my assets from any potential marital claims, future liabilities, or sudden vindictive legal maneuvers David might attempt once he realized his gravy train had completely dried up. Benjamin listened carefully, taking rapid notes on a yellow legal pad. He asked a few pointed, highly technical questions about the exact origin of the funds and the current ownership structure of my business. Because I had always kept my consulting firm registered as a completely separate legal entity, and because David had never once shown the slightest interest in my professional endeavors, the process of migrating the assets was incredibly straightforward. Benjamin drafted the necessary paperwork to transfer my entire portfolio of technology stocks directly into the protective umbrella of the new trust. We then systematically rerouted all of my future business revenue, ensuring that every single dollar my consulting firm generated would flow exclusively into this heavily guarded financial fortress. I watched as he prepared the final execution documents, feeling a profound, deep-seated sense of security taking root in my chest. For years, I had allowed David to make me feel small, to make me feel as though my contributions were secondary to his corporate sales career. But looking at the sheer volume of wealth I was currently moving into, this trust, the undeniable raw data of my own financial success, stared back at me. I was not just a contributing partner. I was a highly successful, completely self-made woman, and I was finally treating my hard-earned money with the absolute respect and aggressive protection it deserved. I signed the heavy stack of legal documents authorizing the immediate transfer of every valuable asset I owned. With my financial shield securely in place, my focus immediately shifted back to the only thing that truly mattered right now. I left Benjamin's office and drove straight back to the hospital, navigating the familiar route with a new, empowering sense of control. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and shining under the late morning sun. When I arrived at the intensive care unit, the atmosphere was vastly different from the suffocating panic of the previous day. My father was awake, tired and frail, but completely stable. The emergency cardiac procedure had been a resounding success. The surgical team had successfully cleared the blockage, and his prognosis was incredibly optimistic. My mother was sitting by his bedside, holding his hand, the terrible paralyzing fear finally gone from her eyes. I stood in the doorway for a moment, simply watching them, letting the overwhelming wave of relief wash over my exhausted body. I walked into the room and kissed my father on the forehead, promising him that he was going to be absolutely fine and that he did not need to worry about a single thing. I then excused myself and walked down to the hospital's dedicated patient care coordination office. I sat down with a senior recovery specialist and initiated the second phase of my plan. I was not going to rely on standard bare minimum insurance coverage for my father's rehabilitation. I used the freshly secured funds from my private business account to establish a premium comprehensive care plan for his recovery. I authorized out-of-network physical therapy sessions with the top cardiac rehabilitation specialists in the city. I arranged for private round-the-clock at-home nursing care for the first 4 weeks following his eventual discharge, ensuring my mother would not have to bear the physical and emotional burden of his recovery alone. I paid for a specialized dietary meal delivery service tailored explicitly for cardiac patients, and I covered the cost of all his newly prescribed highly expensive medications up front. I signed the massive care coordination contract without a single moment of hesitation. Every stroke of my pen was a deliberate, joyful rebellion against my husband's cruel, selfish declaration. David had boldly told me that my parents were my problem, acting as though they were a heavy, unbearable burden that would drag down his precious lifestyle. He had demanded that I handle my family using my own money. I was doing exactly that, providing my father with the absolute highest tier of medical care available in the state, completely out of pocket, and I was doing it effortlessly. The money sitting in my private accounts barely even felt the impact of these premium expenses. My parents were completely safe, deeply protected, and thoroughly insulated from any financial distress. They would never have to worry about hospital bills, nursing costs, or recovery expenses. I had built a solid, impenetrable wall around my family, using the very wealth David had so arrogantly dismissed and underestimated. I walked back to my father's hospital room and spent the rest of the afternoon sitting by his side, chatting quietly with my mother and watching the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart monitor. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settling over my mind. Everything I cared about was finally safe. My assets were completely shielded behind layers of legal armor, and my parents were fully protected by a premium, fully funded recovery plan. As the evening approached, I drove back to the quiet, empty suburban house I shared with David. I walked into the pristine kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of cold water, leaning against the marble countertop. I pulled my smartphone from my purse and opened the digital calendar app, staring at the brightly illuminated screen. Today was the 26th. The first of the month was exactly 5 days away. 5 short days until the automated system attempted to pull $3,000 from a joint account that I had meticulously bled dry. The trap was perfectly flawlessly set. All I had to do now was sit back, maintain my calm, supportive facade, and wait for the ticking clock to strike zero. Sunday evening arrived exactly on schedule, bringing with it the weekly obligation I had come to dread even before I uncovered the massive financial betrayal. It was just 3 days before the first of the month. 3 days before the financial guillotine would drop. David and I were scheduled to attend our mandatory lavish Sunday dinner at his parents' house. Usually I found excuses to skip these gatherings, especially after long weeks of demanding consulting projects, but tonight I would not have missed it for the world. I wanted a front row seat to their unearned arrogance one last time. I wanted to look at their pristine, expensive lives while holding the absolute knowledge that I was the one who had built their foundation, and I was the one who had just quietly demolished it. The drive to Thomas and Linda's sprawling suburban estate took about 45 minutes. When we pulled into his parents' long, sweeping driveway, the absolute audacity of his financial deception was on full display. Their house was a massive custom-built colonial structure sitting on 2 perfectly manicured acres of premium real estate. Landscape lighting illuminated the perfectly trimmed hedges and the blooming rose bushes lining the stone walkway. Parked right near the front entrance, gleaming under the outdoor security lights, was Brittany-leased luxury SUV. I looked at the shiny chrome grille of the vehicle, knowing exactly how much that lease cost every single month, and felt a deep, dark knot of anticipation tighten in my stomach. David parked his car and strutted up to the heavy oak front door, not even bothering to ring the bell before pushing it open. We walked into a grand foyer featuring a sweeping wooden staircase and a massive crystal chandelier that cast brilliant sparkling light across the polished hardwood floors. The house smelled incredibly rich, a heavy blend of expensive roasting meats, savory herbs, and the distinct cloying floral scent of Linda's signature designer perfume. Thomas and Linda emerged from the gourmet kitchen to greet us both, holding crystal glasses of imported red wine. Linda offered me a tight, superficial smile and a brief obligatory hug that involved absolutely no real physical contact. Before I could even formulate a polite response, Brittany came clicking down the grand staircase. She was wearing a silk blouse, tailored designer trousers, and a pair of leather heels that likely cost more than my first car. But what immediately caught my eye was the massive, brand-new designer handbag draped conspicuously over her forearm. She marched straight into the foyer, holding the bag out like a sacred relic for all of us to admire. David whistled appreciatively, telling her she had great taste. Linda fawned over the intricate stitching, completely ignoring the fact that her 28-year-old daughter did not have a job capable of supporting a fraction of this lifestyle. I stared at the expensive bag, maintaining a perfectly pleasant smile. Inside, I was performing the ruthless mental arithmetic. That bag easily cost $3,000 or $4,000. She was wildly swiping her credit cards, completely unaware that in exactly 3 days, the automated payment for that gleaming SUV sitting in the driveway was going to bounce so hard it would trigger an immediate default penalty from the dealership. We took our usual seats, and the entire dynamic of the family immediately snapped into its familiar toxic rhythm. David held court at the head of the table next to his father, dominating the conversation with loud, exaggerated stories about his corporate sales victories. Thomas nodded along respectfully, treating David not just as a son, but as the undisputed patriarch of the family. Linda constantly refilled David's wine glass, ensuring his plate was full, hanging on to his every word with absolute maternal devotion. I sat quietly near the middle of the table, methodically cutting my prime rib, eating slowly, and observing the grand theatrical performance. This was the exact dynamic my hard-earned money had been subsidizing. As the main course was clearing, and Linda began serving an elaborate dessert, the conversation inevitably shifted toward my family. Linda set a small porcelain plate in front of me, her expression shifting into a mask of exaggerated, utterly fake pity. She let out a long, theatrical sigh and looked down the table at her son before turning her sharp eyes toward me. She asked how my father was recovering, but she did not even wait for me to finish my sentence before cutting me off. She leaned forward, placing her manicured hand on the table, and delivered a statement so intensely cruel I physically felt my jaw lock tight. She said it was such a terrible shame that my parents had completely failed to plan for their own retirement. She shook her head disapprovingly, clicking her tongue against her teeth. She announced to the entire table that financial irresponsibility was a tragic flaw, and that relying on expensive emergency care without a proper safety net was incredibly selfish to the younger generation. Then she raised her wine glass toward my husband, her eyes shining with absolute adoration. She thanked God out loud that David was so incredibly responsible. She praised him for his strong moral compass, telling the entire table how lucky I was to be married to a man who took such good, secure care of his family and protected his wealth from being drained by other people's chaotic mistakes. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of her statement struck me like a physical blow to the chest. My hands began to tremble underneath the heavy mahogany table. I felt a sudden, violent urge to scream, to stand up and sweep the fine china directly onto the hardwood floor. I wanted to grab Linda by the shoulders and scream that my chaotic family was not the one quietly stealing $1,500 a month just to keep a roof over their heads. I wanted to look Thomas directly in the eye and tell him his successful, responsible son was actually a deeply indebted fraud who relied on his wife consulting revenue to play the role of the generous provider. The absolute rage burned hot and bright in the back of my throat, threatening to spill over and ruin the perfectly calculated trap I had spent the last 2 days building. But I swallowed the urge. I forced the burning anger down, locking it away behind the cold, calculating wall of my strategic plan. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the tension seep out of my shoulders. I looked at Linda's smug, judgmental face, and then I looked at David, who was puffing out his chest and smiling proudly at his mother, glowing praise. They were so incredibly comfortable in their delusion. They felt so safe in their arrogance. I realized in that moment that exploding right now would only give them the immediate satisfaction of calling me hysterical and defensive. Instead, true justice required letting them continue to build their towering house of cards just a little bit higher before pulling the foundational rug completely out from under them. So I did not scream. I did not cry. I picked up my heavy silver fork, took a small, delicate bite of my dessert, and let the toxic conflict simmer quietly in the elegant dining room. I smiled warmly at my bitter mother-in-law, my eyes locking onto hers with a calm, terrifying serenity that she completely failed to understand. Linda blinked momentarily, thrown off by my unwavering gaze, before quickly recovering and turning her attention to her favorite subject. She reached across the table and patted David on the arm, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light from the chandelier, asking him to tell everyone about the massive new account he had supposedly secured at his corporate office. David did not need to be asked twice. He pushed his empty dessert plate forward, leaned back heavily in his ornate wooden dining chair, and physically puffed out his chest. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive custom suit, a suit he had purchased using the very joint account I had just drained, and began to weave a completely fabricated tale of high-stakes corporate negotiations. He casually dropped complex industry buzzwords and inflated his own importance to absurd levels. He claimed he had single-handedly closed a multi-million-dollar software contract that very Friday afternoon, describing a tense boardroom standoff where his superior sales tactics won the day. He spoke loudly, ensuring his deep voice carried through the entire dining room, bragging that his upcoming quarterly bonus was going to be the largest payout in the history of his firm. The sheer scale of his performance was breathtaking. I did not yet know what David had done with the salary he transferred into his private account, or how deep his personal financial problems truly ran. But the records I had seen proved that the wealthy provider sitting at the head of the table did not exist. His lifestyle depended on money from the joint account, and that account depended overwhelmingly on me. Yet he sat beneath the chandelier describing imaginary bonuses and multi-million-dollar deals, while his parents and sister treated every word as fact. Whatever he was hiding, I knew the truth would surface the moment my income stopped protecting him. Thomas nodded along with absolute reverence, taking a slow sip of his expensive red wine and congratulating his son on his relentless ambition. He told David that real men command respect in the marketplace, and David eagerly agreed. Brittany stopped admiring her expensive new handbag just long enough to ask if his massive bonus meant he was going to upgrade his country club membership to the elite diamond tier, completely oblivious to the fact that her brother was not even paying for his current base membership. David chuckled, a deep, resonant sound of pure manufactured confidence. He told her he was certainly considering it, implying that his personal wealth was growing so rapidly, he practically needed new creative places to spend it. Then David decided to pivot the conversation back to the events at the hospital, eager to use my family's terrifying medical crisis as a convenient pedestal to elevate his own status. He looked at his father with a serious performative expression, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. He explained that true wealth required fierce protection and difficult masculine decisions. He told his parents about my father's $15,000 out-of-network medical bill, deliberately leaving out the harrowing part where my father was literally fighting for his life in the intensive care unit. Instead, he framed the entire devastating situation as a reckless, chaotic financial ambush orchestrated by my parents. He claimed I had hysterically demanded he liquidate his hard-earned corporate savings to cover the deposit because my parents were entirely destitute. He shook his head slowly, looking around the table with furrowed brows, as if seeking immediate validation for a tremendous unfair burden he had been forced to carry. He told them he had to put his foot down immediately to stop the financial bleeding. He proudly recounted how he had stood firmly in the hospital waiting room and established absolute, unwavering financial boundaries. He explicitly told his parents that he had forced me to sign a strict legal document separating our assets, claiming it was the absolute only way to protect the lavish lifestyle he so generously provided for everyone sitting at that table. Linda literally gasped, pressing her manicured hand over her chest, and loudly praised his incredible foresight and bravery. Thomas slapped his hand against the table, declaring that a man always had to protect his castle from outside liabilities, even if those liabilities were his own wife's parents. David soaked it all in a smug, incredibly self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. He felt entirely justified, completely supported by his toxic, enabling echo chamber. But David could never just leave it at his own self-aggrandizement. He always needed to push me down into the dirt to make himself look taller. He turned his gaze toward me, his eyes filled with a sickening, condescending pity. He told his family that it was a harsh lesson, but a deeply necessary one for me to learn for my own personal growth. He casually waved his hand in my direction, a dismissive gesture completely invalidating my highly lucrative data analytics career. He told his parents that while my little freelance gig was a cute, harmless way for me to occupy my time and buy my own groceries, it was obviously not real sustainable money. He patiently explained that because I did not understand how the real high-pressure corporate world worked, I simply did not understand the profound value of protecting substantial wealth. He said he sincerely hoped the financial separation agreement would finally motivate me to take my little spreadsheet hobby seriously, so I could eventually afford to help my parents out on my own. Brittany let out a sharp, mocking laugh, covering her mouth with her hand, her diamond rings catching the light. Linda smiled that same tight, utterly fake smile, telling me in a sickly sweet voice that I should be incredibly grateful to have a husband willing to teach me such important, difficult financial lessons. I felt the smooth, cold stem of my crystal wine glass between my fingers. The glass was cool against my skin, a stark grounding contrast to the boiling heat of their collective suffocating arrogance. I lifted the glass slowly, bringing the dark red wine to my lips. I let the rich, complex flavor wash over my tongue, giving myself a long moment to fully appreciate the absolute poetic perfection of the trap they were all currently sitting inside. They were openly mocking my career. They were mocking the very income that paid the massive mortgage for the roof over Thomas and Linda's heads and funded the lease for the luxury vehicles sitting in their driveway. They were actively celebrating a man whose entire financial existence was a hollow, rapidly rotting shell. I lowered my wine glass and set it gently on the pristine white tablecloth. The sharp clink of the crystal against the porcelain plate drew their attention, silencing Brittany's giggles. I did not glare at David. I did not raise my voice to defend my consulting firm or list my massive corporate retainers to prove my worth. I simply smiled. It was a serene, completely genuine smile, born from the absolute, unwavering certainty of their impending catastrophic destruction. I looked directly into David's eyes, matching his arrogant confidence with a quiet, lethal calm that radiated from the very center of my chest. I spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring every single person at the table heard my exact words. "You are absolutely right, David. Financial independence is crucial. Everyone should stand on their own 2 feet without handouts." The words hung heavily in the warm, food-scented air of the grand dining room. For a brief, fleeting second, a flicker of genuine confusion passed behind David's eyes. He was so accustomed to my quiet submission, or subtle suppressed frustration, that my loud, cheerful agreement caught him completely off guard. But his massive, fragile ego quickly overrode any underlying suspicion. He simply assumed his brilliant, commanding lecture had finally penetrated my stubborn, emotional mind. He assumed I had completely surrendered to his superior logic and dominance. A wide, victorious smile broke across his handsome face, sealing his absolute fate. Linda clapped her hands together lightly, expressing her sheer theatrical delight that I was finally seeing reason and accepting my place. Thomas raised his glass to me, offering a highly patronizing toast to my newfound maturity and financial realism. Brittany rolled her eyes, completely bored with the conversation, and went back to admiring her new, incredibly expensive handbag. The dramatic irony hanging in that beautiful, opulent room was so thick it was practically suffocating me. I sat there entirely surrounded by these incredibly arrogant, entitled people, watching them enthusiastically celebrate their own brilliant financial independence. They were all completely blissfully unaware that I had just permanently severed the main artery, keeping their luxurious fake world alive. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my wine, savoring the sweet taste of victory. The first of the month was only 3 days away, and the absolute devastating panic that was about to rain down upon this family was going to be a masterpiece. The next 3 days passed in a state of surreal tranquility. I went about my normal routine with the precision of a seasoned actor performing a well-rehearsed play. I packed his lunches and kissed his cheek before he left for work every morning. He remained completely oblivious, walking around our house with the inflated swagger of a man who believed he had successfully secured his financial empire. He mentioned how relaxed he felt with our strict new financial boundaries, completely unaware those boundaries sealed his fate. I simply smiled and agreed with him, counting down the hours in my head. When I woke up on the morning of the 2nd of the month, the air in the house felt tangibly different. I got dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, poured my coffee, and drove to my downtown office. The traffic moved sluggishly, but I did not mind. I felt a profound sense of peace. I arrived at my consulting firm, greeted my assistant, and settled into my large leather chair behind my mahogany desk. I opened my laptop and began reviewing a complex dataset for a new client, but my focus was divided. I kept my smartphone resting face up on the polished surface of my desk, knowing that the automated billing systems of the world operated on a very strict, unforgiving schedule. It happened exactly at 10:15 in the morning. The quiet hum of my office was suddenly pierced by the sharp, familiar chime of an incoming text message. Before I could even reach out to check the screen, the chime sounded again, and then a third time, and then a rapid, continuous succession of pings that vibrated the device aggressively against the hard wood of my desk. I leaned back in my chair, picked up the phone, and unlocked the screen. The notifications were pouring in from the family group chat, a digital thread titled The Golden Family that Linda had created years ago to coordinate holiday dinners and share photos of David. I tapped the notification and watched the absolute chaos begin to unfold in real time. The very first message was from Brittany. It was typed in all capital letters, radiating a level of frantic confusion I had never seen from her before. She posted a screenshot from her luxury automotive leasing application. The image clearly displayed a massive red warning banner reading "Payment declined," followed by an immediate late penalty assessment of $75. Her text underneath the image was a barrage of confused questions directed exclusively at David. She asked him why her lease payment had bounced and demanded to know if he had changed the routing numbers without telling her. She complained that the leasing company had just sent her an automated email threatening immediate repossession proceedings if the balance was not cleared within 48 hours. I read her messages slowly, savoring the sheer panic leaking through her digital words. Just 3 nights ago, she had been sitting at that lavish dining table, rolling her eyes at my career and admiring her $1,000 designer handbag. Now she was staring down the barrel of losing her precious status symbol. She sent another flurry of texts tagging David's phone number repeatedly. She told him he needed to fix the bank error right this second because she had plans to drive to the Hamptons this weekend and could not afford to have her car flagged by the dealership. She asked him to just wire the money directly to her personal checking account so she could handle it herself. The sheer entitlement of her request was breathtaking. She still fully believed the money was endlessly flowing, simply caught up in some minor administrative glitch. She had no idea the well had been permanently cemented shut. Less than 5 minutes later, the group chat exploded again. This time, it was from Linda. Her messages were significantly longer and typed with a frantic, breathless urgency that entirely abandoned her usual composed, passive-aggressive tone. She bypassed Brittany's car drama, completely focusing entirely on her own impending disaster. Linda wrote that she had just logged into her regional banking portal to check her balance and discovered a terrifying notification. The monthly mortgage payment for their sprawling suburban estate had been violently rejected due to insufficient funds. She tagged David 3 times in a single paragraph, demanding he answer his phone immediately. She explained that the mortgage servicing company was particularly strict and that a bounced payment carried a massive penalty fee and a direct hit to their credit score. Her texts grew increasingly hysterical as the minutes ticked by without a response from her golden boy. She asked if his corporate payroll department had made a massive mistake with his direct deposit. She suggested he drive down to the local bank branch right away to sort out the frozen funds. I watched the little typing bubbles appear and disappear on the screen as Linda and Brittany fueled each other's mounting panic, their messages overlapping in a desperate crescendo of financial terror. The most beautiful part of the entire spectacle was the deafening silence from David. He was completely unreachable. I knew exactly what his Tuesday morning schedule looked like. He was locked in a mandatory 3-hour regional sales strategy meeting with the senior vice presidents of his firm. He always turned his personal phone completely off during these high-stakes presentations because he wanted to project an image of absolute undivided dedication to the corporate executives. He was sitting in a plush boardroom somewhere across the city, probably bragging about his pipeline, and trying to secure a larger bonus, completely ignorant of the fact that his entire manufactured family empire was currently burning to the ground in a group chat inside his pocket. He was trapped in the very corporate world he used to belittle me, utterly helpless to stop the financial bleeding. I sat perfectly still in my quiet, climate-controlled office, watching the notifications continue to flood my screen. Thomas eventually chimed in, leaving a short, gruff message demanding David step out of his meeting and call his mother immediately because she was hyperventilating in the kitchen. I did not type a single character in response. I did not offer any comfort, any explanation, or any suggestion. I simply became a silent, invisible ghost, observing their destruction from a safe, untouchable distance. I placed the phone back down on my mahogany desk, leaving the screen illuminated so I could watch the messages continue to roll in. I picked up my ceramic mug, took a long, satisfying sip of my hot coffee, and turned my attention back to the complex data models on my laptop screen. My own bank accounts were perfectly secure. My business was thriving. My father was resting comfortably in a premium rehabilitation facility surrounded by the best private nurses my money could buy. I had successfully severed the parasitic cords that had been draining my life for 4 years. The digital chaos unfolding on my phone was not my problem anymore. It was David's problem. He had explicitly demanded strict financial separation, and he was currently receiving the very first, agonizing taste of what that truly meant. The first dominoes had finally fallen crashing down with a spectacular, irreversible momentum, and I knew with absolute certainty that the confrontation waiting for me at home tonight was going to be the single most satisfying moment of my entire life. The drive back to our home that evening felt like a quiet, deeply satisfying victory lap. The Boston traffic was just as heavily congested as it had been that morning, but I barely noticed the sea of bright red taillights stretching out endlessly in front of me. I arrived at our quiet suburban house just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the perfectly manicured front lawn. I unlocked the heavy front door, stepped inside the quiet foyer, and immediately went about setting the precise stage for his inevitable arrival. I walked upstairs, changed out of my stiff tailored office suit, and slipped into a comfortable cashmere sweater and soft, dark leggings. I wanted to look entirely relaxed, the absolute picture of a woman completely unbothered by the financial chaos rapidly consuming her husband. I walked downstairs into the spacious kitchen, turned on the warm pendant lights hanging over the large marble island, and put the kettle on the stove to boil. I prepared a hot cup of chamomile tea, letting the soothing herbal scent completely fill the room. I retrieved the thick black binder containing my financial documents and the signed post-nuptial agreement from my home office and set it gently on the pristine marble counter. I pulled up one of the high padded bar stools, sat down, and waited. The silence in the house was incredibly heavy, charged with the dangerous electric anticipation of a severe thunderstorm about to break. I did not have to wait very long for him to finally arrive. At exactly 6:45, the heavy wooden front door did not just open. It was violently shoved inward, slamming hard against the interior wall with a terrifying sound like a gunshot. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded aggressively across the hardwood floor of the foyer. David burst into the kitchen, and the sheer physical transformation he had undergone in the span of a single workday was genuinely startling to witness. The man who had strutted out of this house that morning, wrapped in arrogant confidence and a pristine custom suit, was completely gone. In his place stood a broken man on the absolute brink of a total psychological and physical collapse. His expensive navy suit jacket was deeply wrinkled and hanging loosely from his slumping shoulders. His patterned silk tie was yanked down aggressively, the top button of his expensive dress shirt completely undone and dark. Heavy circles of sweat stained the delicate fabric under his arms. His face, usually tanned and remarkably smooth, was a sickly pale shade of gray. His eyes were wide, darting wildly around the room, until they finally locked onto me, sitting peacefully at the kitchen island. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down rapidly, as if he had just sprinted for several miles in the hot afternoon sun just to reach the front door. He took two incredibly large, aggressive steps forward into the kitchen, his hands trembling visibly at his sides. He did not even bother to ask how my day was. He did not bother with any kind of normal greeting. He practically shouted, his deep voice cracking with a messy mixture of absolute fury and raw, unfiltered panic. He demanded to know exactly what the hell was going on with our bank. He pulled his smartphone out of his pocket and slammed it face up onto the marble countertop, the screen still brightly displaying a long string of frantic text messages from his mother. He told me he had just spent the last 2 agonizing hours being completely humiliated by the regional bank manager over the phone while hiding in his corporate office. He screamed that the joint checking account was entirely overdrawn and completely frozen. He yelled that his mother's massive mortgage payment had bounced, that Brittany was threatening to call a lawyer over her luxury car lease, and that his own exclusive country club had just emailed him a formal notice of suspended membership due to a failed automated transfer. He slapped his hand flat against the cold marble, demanding to know where my direct deposit went. He asked me if I had foolishly fallen for some kind of massive online phishing scam, or if my consulting firm had suddenly gone bankrupt without me telling him. He was completely frantic, his mind desperately grasping at any possible external excuse, because his massive, fragile ego simply could not process the terrible reality that I had intentionally orchestrated this entire collapse. He leaned heavily over the island, his face red and contorted with rage, ordering me to log into my corporate portal right this second and transfer the missing $3,000 back into the joint account before his parents lost their home and his sister lost her car. I did not flinch away from his sudden explosive anger. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not reach for my phone to obey his frantic commands. I simply picked up my ceramic mug, blew softly on the steaming surface of my chamomile tea, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The stark contrast between his absolute sweaty hysteria and my quiet, unshakable calm seemed to infuriate him even more. He opened his mouth to shout another aggressive demand, but I calmly placed my mug back down on a coaster and held up my right hand, stopping him dead in his tracks. I reached over to the thick black binder resting beside my tea. I opened the cover, unclipped the heavy metal rings, and carefully extracted the original fully executed copy of our post-nuptial agreement. I placed the document flat against the smooth marble surface and used the tips of my fingers to slide it slowly across the wide island directly toward him. The heavy legal paper came to a gentle stop just inches from his clenched fists. I watched his panicked eyes dart down to the printed document. He recognized it immediately. It was the exact same stack of papers he had so eagerly and triumphantly signed just a few short nights ago, while drinking a beer on our living room couch, completely convinced he was protecting his wealth from my incredibly demanding family. I looked him straight in the eyes without blinking, ensuring he could see the cold, immovable reality staring back at him. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the acoustics of the large kitchen carry every single syllable with absolute devastating clarity. I explicitly told him there was absolutely no bank error. I told him there was no phishing scam. I told him my consulting firm was more profitable than ever, but those profits would never touch that joint account again. I tapped my index finger twice against his sweeping signature at the bottom of the final page. I smiled, feeling the absolute magnificent weight of the justice I was finally delivering after 4 years of his deception. My money is exclusively mine, David, just like you explicitly wanted when you stood in that hospital. I am certainly not draining my hard-earned private savings to bail out your family's incredibly poor financial planning. Your parents are entirely your problem. He simply stared at me, his mouth opening and closing completely soundlessly as the absolute catastrophic realization finally hit him hard. The arrogant, wealthy persona he had spent years meticulously building was now completely shattered, and the silence that followed in our kitchen was the most profoundly beautiful sound I had ever heard. He stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was his heavy, ragged breathing. Then the shock began to wear off, replaced by a desperate need to regain control. He slammed his hand flat against the island, shaking his head in denial. He told me to stop playing games, insisting this was not the time to teach him a lesson. His voice lost its commanding corporate edge, pitching into a strained, begging tone. He told me this was a massive, unforeseen emergency, and I needed to be a supportive wife. He pointed a trembling finger at the post-nuptial agreement, claiming it was just a piece of paper completely irrelevant to the immediate crisis. He demanded that I open my banking application right this second and wire the $3,000 back into the joint account. He promised we could negotiate the finances later, but right now his mother was crying and his sister was panicking, so I needed to transfer the funds immediately. I did not reach for my phone. I simply adjusted my posture on the bar stool, folding my hands neatly. I looked at him with genuine cold curiosity. I asked him why he needed my money to solve his family emergency. I reminded him that he was a highly successful corporate director who had just bragged about closing a multi-million-dollar software contract at Sunday dinner. I kept my tone perfectly even, mirroring the exact patronizing patience he used to belittle my career. I told him that $3,000 was surely just a drop in the bucket for a man with such a massive corporate salary. I suggested he simply log into his private banking portal and transfer his own wealth to his mother to cover her mortgage. I told him he had proudly established the boundary that my family was my problem, so it only made logical sense that his family was entirely his problem. David gripped the edges of the marble countertop, his knuckles turning completely white. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently. He could not use his own money. He finally choked out his voice, dropping to a harsh whisper. He claimed his wealth was currently tied up in complex, non-liquid investments. He spun a rapid, chaotic lie about high-yield offshore accounts and restricted corporate stock options that could not be cashed out without a massive penalty. He told me he was cash poor at this exact moment due to a brilliant strategic investment he had made last week. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to maintain his golden boy illusion, but he was sweating profusely, and the lie crumbled instantly. I pushed back, my voice sharp and unyielding. I told him I did not believe a single word coming out of his mouth. I demanded to know where the money was. I asked him how a man who siphoned 80% of his paycheck into a hidden account every week could possibly be cash poor. The question struck him like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the stainless steel oven. He realized in that exact moment that I had seen everything. He realized I had audited the ledger, traced the hidden accounts, and mapped out every parasitic transfer. The final desperate walls of his incredibly fragile ego simply caved in. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic sob that echoed miserably in the warm kitchen. He dragged his hands down his pale, sweat-slicked face and looked at me with completely defeated eyes. He confessed that there were no offshore investments. There were no restricted stock options. There was no massive quarterly bonus waiting for him. He admitted that he was entirely broke. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his confession. He paced frantically across the hardwood floor, his hands tugging nervously at his hair. The ugly truth finally spilled out of him in a rapid torrent of shame and failure. He told me he was drowning in $80,000 of incredibly high-interest credit card debt. The number hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He confessed that the corporate sales world he worshipped was brutally competitive. To get the big accounts, he felt he had to look the part of a massive success. He had been funding a fake baller lifestyle for years, charging thousands to maxed-out credit cards to buy custom-tailored suits, expensive rounds of drinks, and lavish gifts for his superiors. He admitted he had developed a severe sports betting addiction, foolishly chasing massive parlays and high-stakes wagers in an endless attempt to pay off his mounting debts. Instead of winning, he had dug the hole so incredibly deep he could no longer see the surface. He stopped pacing and leaned heavily against the kitchen counter, refusing to meet my eyes. He looked down at the floor, his voice trembling with absolute humiliation. He confessed that his corporate salary barely covered the minimum monthly payments on his massive mountain of debt. He admitted that my independent consulting income, the very career he had constantly mocked to his parents, was the absolute only thing keeping his entire house of cards standing. He had relied completely on my weekly direct deposits to cover the property taxes, utilities, groceries, and secretly fund the luxurious lifestyle of his parents and sister. He had essentially been running a massive financial shell game, moving my money around to maintain the illusion of his immense success while his personal finances rotted away. He looked up at me, his face glistening with tears, begging for a shred of the empathy he had so violently denied me at the hospital. He pleaded with me to understand the incredible pressure he was under to be the perfect provider. He tried to frame his massive deception as a tragic burden he had heroically carried in silence, claiming he was only trying to protect me from his debt. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I looked at the broken man standing in my kitchen and felt only profound disgust. He had not stolen my money to protect me. He had stolen my money to protect his incredibly fragile ego. He had been perfectly willing to let my father die to preserve a bank balance he desperately needed to cover his own reckless mistakes. I stood up slowly from the bar stool, smoothing the fabric of my cashmere sweater. I looked down at the signed post-nuptial agreement resting on the marble island. It was no longer just a defensive shield protecting my personal assets. It was the absolute documentation of his total destruction. He had arrogantly demanded strict financial separation, believing he was cutting off a desperate leech, only to realize he had taken a saw directly to his own lifeline. I told him he now had exactly what he wanted. His hidden debts were his. His family's impending property foreclosures and vehicle repossessions were his. The $80,000 of high-interest credit card debt was his heavy burden alone to carry. I picked up my ceramic mug of chamomile tea, completely unfazed by his pathetic weeping, and took a deeply satisfying sip. The vicious, fast-paced argument had permanently drained the very last drop of his false bravado, leaving absolutely nothing but the undeniable, ugly truth exposed in the bright kitchen light. He did not apologize. Instead of taking accountability, David slowly pushed himself off the cold marble counter, his eyes darting away from mine in complete and utter defeat. He grabbed his smartphone and walked out of the kitchen without another word, his footsteps heavy and dragging on the hardwood stairs. I stayed downstairs, finishing my tea in the quiet, pristine kitchen, letting the adrenaline slowly fade from my system. A few minutes later, the muffled, panicked sound of his voice drifted down from the upstairs hallway. He was on the phone with his mother. I walked quietly to the base of the stairs and listened. Even in the face of absolute, undeniable financial ruin, his desperate need to protect his golden boy image overrode any shred of honesty or dignity. I heard him frantically spinning a vicious, fabricated narrative to explain the bounced checks and frozen accounts. He did not tell Thomas and Linda about his $80,000 of credit card debt. He did not mention the sports betting, the maxed-out limits, or the fake baller lifestyle he had been secretly living. Instead, he painted himself as the tragic, helpless victim of a vindictive and deeply unstable wife. He told his mother that the intense stress of my father's heart attack had completely broken me, pushing me into a severe mental breakdown. He claimed I was acting entirely out of spite, punishing him for setting healthy, necessary boundaries at the hospital by maliciously freezing all of his hard-earned accounts and illegally locking him out of his own money. He promised his mother he would handle my hysterical behavior as quickly as possible and get their funds released immediately. It was a pathetic, cowardly lie designed to buy himself a few more hours of their respect. I simply smiled in the dark hallway and walked back to the kitchen to wash my mug. I knew his fabricated story would only make the impending collision that much more spectacular. The following day passed with an eerie, incredibly tense silence. David left for his corporate office before I even woke up, likely too deeply ashamed to face me in the daylight, or perhaps just desperate to escape the suffocating reality of our house. I spent the morning at my consulting firm successfully closing a new analytics contract that added another massive retainer to my newly shielded business account. In the afternoon, I visited my father at his premium cardiac rehabilitation center. He was doing wonderfully, sitting up in bed, joking with the private nurses, and eating a specialized meal. Seeing him so well cared for, completely insulated from financial stress, solidified every single decision I had made over the past week. I drove home that evening feeling completely grounded, peaceful, and absolutely untouchable. I knew David's cowardly phone call would inevitably trigger a massive retaliation from his family, and I was entirely prepared to face it. I unlocked the front door, kicked off my heels, and poured myself a glass of cold water. I had just walked into the living room to turn on the evening news when the heavy oak front door suddenly flew open, slamming hard against the entryway wall. David had never bothered to ask for his spare key back from his parents, a minor oversight that now allowed them to completely invade my sanctuary without warning. Heavy, aggressive footsteps stomped across the hardwood floor of the foyer. Before I could even set my glass down on the mantelpiece, Thomas, Linda, and Brittany stormed directly into my living room. They did not knock. They did not announce themselves. They marched into my house with the absolute blinding entitlement of wealthy property owners confronting a criminal who had just broken into their private vault. Linda led the furious charge, her face flushed red with indignant rage. Her expensive designer trench coat was completely unbuttoned, billowing behind her, and she was clutching her luxury handbag so tightly her knuckles were perfectly white. Thomas flanked her on the right, his jaw set in a hard, intimidating line, puffing his chest out in a show of aggressive male authority. Brittany brought up the rear, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring at me with pure, unfiltered venom. David trailed in a few seconds later, closing the front door quietly behind him. He stayed near the entryway, lingering cowardly in the shadows of the foyer. He looked absolutely terrified, completely trapped between the massive lie he had just fed his parents and the devastating reality I was holding in my home office safe. He refused to look at me, staring intently at the floorboards while his family prepared to tear me apart on his behalf. Linda stopped in the center of the living room and pointed directly at me. "What is wrong with you?" she shouted. "David told us you froze his accounts because you were angry about your father. You have no right to punish an entire family because you cannot control your emotions." Thomas stepped beside her, using his larger frame to make the confrontation feel like an interrogation. He accused me of stealing from his son and warned that his attorney was prepared to file a lawsuit for financial abuse. According to him, every dollar in the joint account belonged to David because David was the provider. Brittany threw her car keys onto the coffee table. "The leasing company sent someone to my apartment," she snapped. "Do you understand how humiliating that was? Transfer the money tonight, including the late fee, before they take my car." None of them asked about my father. None of them asked what David had done at the hospital. They had entered my home for one reason: the money they believed they were entitled to had stopped arriving. I looked past them toward David. He remained near the front door, pale and silent, allowing his family to speak for him. "Tell her," Linda ordered. "Tell your wife to release your money." David finally looked at me. "Rebecca, just transfer the $3,000, he said quietly. "We can discuss everything else after everyone calms down." His request confirmed what I already knew. He had not brought his family here to learn the truth. He had brought them here to overwhelm me. He expected their anger to frighten me into restoring the financial system he had built on my income. I turned toward Linda. "Which money are you asking me to release?" She stared at me as though the question were absurd. "David's money," she answered. "The money he uses to take care of this family." Thomas stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You have 5 minutes to open the banking application and correct whatever you did. Otherwise, I will call the police and report you for fraud." Brittany crossed her arms. "And I want the penalty fee included." I looked at David again. Even now, he said nothing about the private account into which he had transferred most of his salary. He did not admit that my consulting revenue had funded the mortgage, the vehicle, or his country club. He simply stood behind his family and waited for me to surrender. That silence ended whatever remained of our marriage. "I did not freeze David's money," I said. "I stopped depositing mine." The room became quiet for the first time since they arrived. Linda's expression flickered, but she quickly recovered. "You are lying." "No," I replied. "David is." I turned toward the hallway leading to my office. Linda moved to block me, but I stopped before she could reach me. "Stay here," I said. "Since all of you came to demand an explanation, I am going to give you one. But after you see the records, none of you will ever be able to pretend you did not know the truth." I walked past her without raising my voice. Behind me, Thomas continued muttering threats, Brittany demanded her car payment, and Linda ordered David to regain control of his household. David remained silent. He knew exactly what I was going to retrieve. The hallway leading to my home office felt incredibly quiet compared to the deafening chaos I had just left behind in the living room. The thick walls of our house muffled Linda's continued shrieking and Thomas's booming threats, reducing their aggressive demands to a dull, angry roar. I stepped into my office and closed the solid oak door behind me, instantly cutting off the noise completely. The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the window blinds. I did not bother to turn on the overhead lights. I walked directly to the heavy steel safe bolted securely to the floor in the corner of the room. I spun the combination dial with practiced precision, feeling the familiar mechanical clicks under my fingertips. I pulled the heavy metal door open and reached inside. Sitting right on the top shelf, exactly where I had placed it after my meeting with my financial advisor, was the thick black leather binder. I pulled it out and held it in my hands for a moment. It was surprisingly heavy, packed tightly with years of undeniable financial evidence, annotated bank statements, highlighted transaction histories, and the freshly signed post-nuptial agreement. This binder was not just a collection of papers. It was the absolute, irrefutable truth of the last 4 years of my life. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air of the office fill my lungs, and turned back toward the door. I walked back down the hallway, the heavy binder clutched securely against my side. As I approached the living room, the sheer volume of their screaming washed over me once again. They had not calmed down in the slightest during my brief absence. If anything, their collective rage had only intensified. Linda was pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, furiously lecturing David about how he needed to establish firmer control over his household. Thomas was standing by the fireplace, his arms still crossed, loudly reciting the names of the ruthless corporate litigators he planned to unleash on me in the morning. Brittany had collapsed dramatically onto the sofa, holding her face in her hands and sobbing loudly about her ruined weekend plans and her damaged social reputation. David was still hovering cowardly near the entryway, his face pale and slick with sweat, completely paralyzed by the impending disaster. None of them noticed me walk back into the room until I was standing directly in front of the glass coffee table. I did not say a single word. I simply lifted the heavy black binder high into the air and slammed it down onto the solid glass surface of the coffee table with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. The incredibly loud, sharp crack echoed through the entire living room like a gunshot. The sound instantly sliced through the chaotic wall of their screaming. Linda froze mid-stride, her mouth hanging open in mid-sentence. Thomas stopped his aggressive pacing, his head snapping toward me in sheer surprise. Brittany jumped violently on the sofa, her dramatic sobbing cutting off into a startled hiccup. Even David physically flinched backward, his eyes widening in absolute terror. The sudden total silence in the room was deafening. Every single pair of eyes was locked onto the heavy black binder resting in the center of the table. I slowly unhooked the metal clasp on the front of the binder and flipped the heavy leather cover open. The first page was a master summary I had personally compiled, but I bypassed it entirely. I reached into the first section and pulled out a thick stack of printed bank statements. These were not the sanitized limited view statements David had likely shown them in the past. These were the complete unredacted transaction histories from our joint account, meticulously detailed and explicitly clear. I picked up the first packet stapled neatly in the top corner and walked directly over to Linda. She stared at me, her eyes darting nervously between my calm face and the papers in my hand. I held the packet out to her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before snatching it aggressively from my grip, clearly expecting to find a printed apology or a wire transfer confirmation. I turned my back to her and walked over to Thomas, handing him a perfectly identical stack of documents. He took them with a harsh scoff, adjusting his posture to look as intimidating as possible. Finally, I walked over to the sofa and dropped the third packet directly onto Brittany's lap. She looked down at the papers as if I had just handed her a live explosive. I stepped back to the center of the room, standing behind the coffee table. I looked at the three of them, my voice cutting through the thick, tense silence with a cold, commanding authority. I told them to look at the very first page of the packet. I instructed them to look at the bright yellow highlighted lines indicating the incoming direct deposits. Linda frowned, pulling her reading glasses from her designer handbag and sliding them onto her nose. She looked down at the paper, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers. I told them to pay very close attention to the origin of those specific deposits. I explained that the massive sums of money funneling into that joint account every single week did not originate from David's corporate payroll department. They originated entirely from my independent data analytics consulting firm. I watched Thomas's face change as he read the business name printed clearly next to the massive deposit amounts. His thick brow furrowed in deep confusion, his eyes darting back and forth across the page as his brain struggled to process the irrefutable data sitting right in his own hands. I did not give them a moment to catch their breath. I instructed them to turn to the third page of the packet. I told them to look at the outgoing transaction history, specifically the automated wire transfers, highlighted in bright pink ink. I walked over to Linda and tapped my index finger forcefully against the paper she was holding. I pointed directly to the $1,500 recurring transfer. I told her to read the destination routing information out loud. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words completely died in her throat. Her face, previously flushed with self-righteous anger, instantly drained of all color. She recognized the name of her own regional mortgage servicing company. She stared at the highlighted line, her hands beginning to tremble violently, causing the crisp paper to rustle in the quiet room. I turned to Brittany, who was staring blankly at her own copy. I pointed to the $1,000 transfer highlighted right below her parents' mortgage payment. I told her that was the monthly lease payment for the luxury SUV currently sitting in my driveway. I explicitly stated that it was my money generated entirely by the career she had spent years mocking that was keeping her from driving a cheap used car. I looked at Thomas, who was staring at the papers in absolute disbelief. I told him to look at the final highlighted line on the page, the $500 transfer to his son's country club. I watched the crushing realization wash over his face. They had stormed into my house to demand their money. They were finally realizing the money had never belonged to David. I kept my gaze locked squarely on Thomas. He was still holding the thick packet of bank statements in his large hands, but his intimidating posture had completely deflated. The blustering, aggressive patriarch who had just threatened to destroy me in federal court was suddenly staring at the undeniable, irrefutable data proving his entire life was subsidized by my labor. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure every single syllable carried the heavy, lethal weight of the absolute truth. I told him to look very closely at those exact numbers, because they represented the reality of the golden boy he worshipped so deeply. I watched Thomas swallow hard as I dropped the hammer that would permanently shatter their grand illusion. Your beloved son is not a wealthy corporate provider. He is just an absolute fraud drowning in $80,000 of high-interest credit card debt. He blew his entire salary trying to maintain a fake baller lifestyle for his corporate friends and gambling recklessly on sports. He has absolutely nothing left to his name. I turned my attention to Linda, who was staring at the paper with wide, terrified eyes. I told her I had been paying for that massive suburban estate for 4 long years. I made sure they could boast to their extended family about their incredible retirement. Then I looked at Brittany. I told her I leased her luxury car so she could pretend to be a wealthy socialite while refusing to get a real job. It was my money funding this ridiculous charade from the very beginning. And when my father was dying in the hospital, and I asked for my own money back to save his life, David looked me dead in the eye and told me my family was my problem, so I protected my wealth. The silence that followed my declaration was incredibly brief. It lasted only a few agonizing seconds before the entire toxic ecosystem of their family completely and violently imploded. The collective rage they had brought into my living room instantly shifted direction, hitting David with the force of a speeding freight train. Thomas crumpled the bank statements in his massive fist and turned slowly toward the entryway, where his son was still cowering in the dark shadows. He looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. His booming voice cracked as he demanded to know if this was true. He asked how he could humiliate this proud family by begging his wife for an allowance to pay his parents' bills. David pressed his back against the heavy wooden door, looking absolutely terrified. He held his hands up in a desperate pleading gesture, but he had absolutely no lies left to spin. He stuttered, trying to formulate an excuse about the struggling economy, but Thomas cut him off with a vicious roar. Thomas yelled that he had raised a strong provider, not a weak, pathetic liar who stole from his own wife to play pretend in the business world. Linda completely ignored her son's pathetic stuttering. She dropped the bank statements and clutched her chest, sinking heavily onto the armchair. She began to hyperventilate, taking short, ragged gasps of air. She was crying because the harsh reality of her own impending poverty had just crashed down upon her head. She rocked back and forth, moaning loudly about her beautiful house. She wailed that the regional mortgage servicing company was going to initiate aggressive foreclosure proceedings by the end of the month if the funds were not restored. She screamed at David, asking where they were supposed to live and how they were supposed to show their faces at the country club, now that everyone in their social circle would know they were completely broke. Her entire identity was wrapped up in the wealthy illusion David had provided, and watching it burn away pushed her into a state of sheer unmanageable panic. Brittany was equally unforgiving. She leaped up from the sofa, her expensive new handbag falling completely forgotten to the hardwood floor. She marched aggressively across the room and shoved her brother hard in the chest. She screamed directly into his face, calling him a broke, pathetic fraud. She yelled that he had completely ruined her life and destroyed her entire social standing in the city. She demanded to know how she was supposed to get to work or go to the grocery store without her luxury car. She smacked his shoulder repeatedly, shrieking that he needed to fix his massive debt right this second and buy her a new vehicle out of his own pocket. She completely turned on the wealthy brother she had idolized just a few hours before, treating him like absolute garbage the moment his wallet snapped shut. David looked like a trapped animal. His family was tearing him apart, ripping away the golden boy status he had sacrificed our entire marriage to maintain. He finally looked past his screaming father and his violently sobbing sister and locked his desperate, tear-filled eyes on me. He took a hesitant step forward, pushing past Brittany. He held his hands out to me, his face streaked with sweat and heavy tears. He begged me to stop this terrifying madness. He pleaded with me to talk to his parents, to explain that we could work out a strict payment plan to save their massive house. He told me he would go to an inpatient gambling rehabilitation facility tomorrow and cut up every single one of his credit cards. He promised he would spend the rest of his natural life paying me back for every single dollar he had secretly siphoned from my business account over the last 4 years. He was practically on his knees begging for mercy from the very woman he had so arrogantly dismissed at her most incredibly vulnerable moment. I stood silently behind the solid glass coffee table, just watching him beg. I felt absolutely no pity for the broken man sweating so miserably in my foyer. He only apologized because he had finally been caught red-handed, and the severe consequences were loudly screaming at him. I calmly looked at Linda, wailing uncontrollably about her lost social status, and Thomas pacing furiously while cursing his own son's name. They were a highly toxic family, built entirely on dark lies, pure entitlement, and bottomless greed. They truly deserved exactly what they were experiencing right now. I told David in a calm and perfectly steady voice that there was absolutely nothing left for us to ever discuss. I told him I was not going to save his parents' sprawling house from the bank. I was not going to pay the penalty fees for his sister's repossessed car. I was never going to fund his incredibly fake corporate lifestyle ever again. I told him the strict financial separation he had so eagerly demanded in that freezing hospital waiting room was now permanent and absolute. The massive damage he had caused to our marriage was completely irreversible. I watched the last shred of desperate hope drain entirely from his red eyes. He slowly realized in that exact agonizing moment that no amount of desperate begging, loud crying, or empty promising would ever undo the devastating reality of his past actions. The grand golden family illusion was truly dead forever. The toxic financial parasite had been completely and permanently severed. He was finally and truly standing entirely on his very own 2 feet without my help. I turned my attention away from his defeated, weeping face and reached back into the thick black binder resting on the glass coffee table. The living room around me was still a swirling, chaotic vortex of anger and bitter recriminations. Thomas was aggressively pacing the length of the Persian rug, muttering dark curses under his breath, while Linda continued to hyperventilate in the armchair, mourning the impending loss of her opulent social status. Brittany was practically screaming at the ceiling, demanding a completely impossible solution to her ruined weekend. Over the deafening sound of his own family viciously tearing him apart, I pulled the final most important document from the very back pocket of the leather binder. It was printed on heavy cream-colored legal stock bound neatly at the top corner with a crisp, unmistakable seal. I walked slowly across the hardwood floor, completely ignoring the screaming in-laws, and stopped directly in front of David. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and swollen, a fresh wave of panic washing over his pale features as he stared at the thick stack of paper in my hand. He slowly reached out with trembling fingers and took the document. He did not even need to read past the bold capitalized letters printed at the very top of the first page to understand exactly what it was. They were finalized, heavily airtight divorce papers prepared meticulously by my attorney and completely ready for his signature. David let out a hollow, agonizing gasp, his knees physically buckling slightly as the absolute finality of the situation crushed whatever tiny shred of hope he had left. Linda abruptly stopped her dramatic wailing, her sharp eyes locking onto the legal document trembling in her son's hands. The sudden realization that the marriage was officially over sent a new, different kind of panic through her body. She stood up from the armchair, smoothing down her designer trench coat in a desperate, pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of her former authority. She pointed her finger at me, her voice shaking with a mixture of raw fear and lingering arrogance. She aggressively declared that if I was going to be so incredibly selfish as to file for divorce over a simple financial disagreement, then I needed to pack my bags and get out of her son's beautiful house immediately. She loudly announced that David had worked incredibly hard to purchase this sprawling suburban property, and she would absolutely not allow a vindictive, hysterical woman to steal his real estate in a divorce settlement. Thomas immediately chimed in, stepping forward and puffing out his chest, nodding in fierce agreement. He crossed his thick arms and demanded I hand over the house keys right this second, claiming he would personally oversee my immediate eviction from his son's hard-earned property. I looked at Linda, then at Thomas, and finally let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed brightly against the high ceilings of the living room. The sound of my laughter completely derailed their aggressive momentum, leaving them staring at me in absolute stunned confusion. I turned my gaze back to David, who was staring down at the floorboards, completely unwilling to look his parents in the eye. I kept my voice incredibly calm, savoring the absolute perfection of this final, devastating revelation. I told Linda she was absolutely right about one thing. This beautiful, sprawling suburban house was indeed purchased with hard-earned money, but it was certainly not her son's money. I explicitly explained that I had purchased this property 2 full years before I even met David completely in cash, using the massive profits from my data analytics consulting firm. I told them the deed was held securely under a private limited liability company that I had formed specifically to protect my personal real estate assets. I watched the color drain completely from Linda's face as I delivered the final crushing blow. David's name had never been on the deed. He had absolutely no legal claim to the property, no equity in the structure, and thanks to the incredibly strict postnuptial agreement he had so arrogantly signed just days ago, he had absolutely no avenue to ever challenge my sole ownership in court. He had been living in my property with my permission, and that permission was officially revoked. The silence that fell over the living room this time was absolute and entirely suffocating. The golden boy illusion had not just shattered it, had been completely vaporized. He had lied to them about his corporate success, he had lied about paying their bills, and he had lied about owning the very roof over his own head. I looked down at my watch, checking the time with deliberate, methodical precision. I looked back up at the three intruders standing paralyzed in my living room. I told David he had exactly 1 hour to walk upstairs, pack his personal clothing, gather his toiletries, and get his entire family out of my property. I explicitly warned him that if he or his family were still standing inside my home, when the 60 minutes expired, I would immediately call the local authorities and have them all formally removed and charged with criminal trespassing. The ensuing hour was the most incredibly pathetic spectacle I had ever witnessed. David stumbled heavily up the wooden staircase, his shoulders completely slumped, looking like a man walking directly to his own execution. Thomas and Linda did not say another word to me. They turned around in absolute crushing shame and walked out the heavy front door, leaving their ruined son to pack his bags alone. Brittany followed close behind them, sobbing hysterically about how unfair her life was, her heavy footsteps fading down the front walkway. Exactly 55 minutes later, David walked back down the stairs carrying 2 large suitcases. He did not look at me. He simply walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind him with a soft final click. I walked over to the entryway, threw the deadbolt, and leaned my forehead against the cool, solid wood. The house was finally completely silent, completely peaceful, and entirely mine. Flash forward exactly 6 months. The bitter, freezing winter had finally melted away, replaced by a bright, vibrant Boston spring. I am standing in the sunlit atrium of a premium state-of-the-art cardiac rehabilitation center. The air smells like fresh blooming flowers, rather than sterile hospital antiseptic. I am looking through the large glass window of the physical therapy wing, watching my father walk confidently across the room, entirely unassisted, a wide, healthy smile spreading across his face as he jokes with his private nurse. My mother is sitting nearby, completely relaxed, reading a novel and sipping herbal tea. They are safe, they are happy, and they are completely insulated from any financial worry. My data analytics consulting firm recently secured 2 massive international contracts, effectively doubling my annual business revenue and padding the ironclad trust I had established. The scorched earth justice I had orchestrated had played out with absolute, ruthless perfection. Linda and Thomas officially lost their sprawling suburban estate to foreclosure 3 months ago. The regional bank seized the property, and they were forced to move into a tiny, outdated rental apartment on the far outskirts of the city, utterly humiliated and completely shunned by their elite country club friends. Brittany's luxury vehicle was aggressively repossessed in the middle of the night, leaving her to rely on public transportation and drastically reducing her arrogant social media posts. As for David, the man who had proudly declared my family was my problem, he is currently living in a cramped, windowless studio apartment located directly above a noisy bowling alley. His corporate sales position barely covers his rent, because his wages are being aggressively garnished by multiple credit card companies to pay down his massive mountain of debt. He has absolutely nothing left of his fake, luxurious life. I step away from the glass window, feeling the warm spring sunlight washing over my face. A deep, profound sense of absolute freedom settles into my chest. I did not just survive a deeply toxic, financially abusive marriage. I completely dismantled the parasite, protected the people I truly love, and reclaimed every single piece of my stolen life. I looked directly at the camera with a bright, entirely genuine smile. The absolute best revenge is not just exposing the truth. The best revenge is massive, unbothered, unparalleled success. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who tried to drain your light to fuel their own ego? Let me know your absolute best survival stories in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more real stories about establishing ironclad boundaries, building unshakable independence, and remembering that your incredible worth is never defined by a partner who refuses to see it. Thank you so much for watching, and remember to always protect your peace at all costs. Looking back on the absolute chaos of that month, the most valuable lesson I learned was about the dangerous illusion of safety. For 4 years, I blindly trusted my husband to manage our shared resources because I wanted to believe in the traditional ideal of an equal partnership. But I learned the hard way that blind trust without verification is a massive vulnerability. Financial independence is not just about having money sitting in a bank. It is about having options, leverage, and the absolute ability to protect the people you truly love when a terrifying crisis strikes. If I had not quietly maintained my own separate business account, my father might not have survived that hospital visit, and I would still be unknowingly funding the luxurious lifestyle of a family that secretly despised me. The second lesson is about the true nature of boundaries. David thought he was setting a boundary to protect his wealth and punish me. But true boundaries are meant to protect your peace, not to maliciously abandon your partner in their darkest hour. When someone shows you who they really are during a moment of crisis, believe them the very first time. Let their cruelty be the exact catalyst for your own liberation. Never let anyone make you feel small or dismiss your hard work just to inflate their own fragile ego. Have you ever discovered a massive secret that completely changed the way you viewed a relationship? How did you take your power back from a toxic partner? Let me know your absolute best survival stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more real stories about establishing ironclad boundaries, exposing toxic behavior, and building unshakable independence. Thank you so much for listening, and remember to always protect your peace at all costs.